Hi dear students, you are welcome in this video. We are started a series on Indian writing in English and we are covering the history of Indian writing in English in brief. And this is the next video in the same series. Here you see that today we are going to talk about post-independence Indian English literature, and we are covering here the period you can see 1947 to 1980, and this is the first part in this series. In the previous video we talked about the pre-independence Indian writing in English, and we have covered so many genres in pre-independence period, that is 1800 to 1947, here 1947 to 1980, and exclusively we will talk about here poetry. So poetry will be our main concern. Before that, let's talk about the probable questions. Here you may ask this type of questions in the examinations. Very first, what is the contribution of post-independence Indian English women poets? Now here emphasis on women poets. The second question may be, discuss the contribution of Indian English poets in the post-independence era. What is the contribution of Indian English poets? So these are the probable questions. There may be other types of questions too, which you can cover through this video. And today we will talk about post-independence Indian English poetry 1947 to 1980. Before that, again, let me tell you that there were some magazines and journals which have contributed in the development of Indian writing in English. And here you see these magazines and journals like Illustrated Weekly of India. This is Quest, or it is now called as New Quest Indian Literature. Then you have Indian Writing Today, the Literary Criterion. Then you have the Literary Half Yearly, the Writers Workshop. This is Vuru, again very important miscellany. Poetry India, the Poet Indian Wear, Litcrit, Minimax. Then the Indian Literary Review. Then you have Tenor, the Indian Journal of English Studies, the Journal of Indian Writing in English, the Indian Book Chronicles, Muse India, etc. So these are some of the post-independence magazines or journals which have contributed in the development of Indian writing in English. You can search these journals online too, or you can have offline. Now dear students, again let me tell you that this book is very important. I am telling you in every video, this is the History of Indian Writing in English. It is written by M.K. Naik and published by Sahitya Academy. For more information, you can consult this book. This book will help you in understanding the development of Indian writing in English. Now let's talk about the main part of this video, which is the development of poetry in 1947 to 1980 during this period. Now before that, we have to understand the four moments in the post-independence English poetry in India, or there are four kind of things which we need to understand. Very first, we have Arvindo school of poetry. So there are four schools or four kind of things in post-independence poetry. One is the Arvindo school of poetry, in which we find these poets Dilip Kumar Roy, Themis, Ronen, Prithvi Singh Nahar, Prithvendra N. Mukherjee, V. Madhusudan Reddy, K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar, and V.K. Gokak. Then we find there is a new poetry after post-independence, and the contribution of this writers workshop is very important in the development of poetry and overall Indian writing in English. Then we have some of the women poets which we are considering in this video. Now let's talk about this is the picture of Sri Arvindo. Now let's talk about the very first poet, Nissim Ezekiel, whose lifespan is 1924 to 2004, and he is very famous in Indian writing in English as a poet. Now you see Nissim Ezekiel has taken first in the post-independence Indian writing in English because his name is very important in the later development of Indian writing in English. And some of the poems or collections of poems, here we have A Time to Change 1950 to 60 poems, the third, The Unfinished Man, The Exact Name, Hymns in Darkness. And if you look at his poems, you will find alienation is a central theme, and he has provided inspiration to later generations of poets. Many poets based their poems or took inspiration from Nissim Ezekiel and composed their poetry. So his name is very important. This is Nissim Ezekiel. Now You have these poems very famous by Nissim Ezekiel: Background Casually, Goodbye Party 2, Miss, Pushpa, T.S., Poet Lover, and Bird Watcher. These are most famous poems of Nissim Ezekiel. Still, we read these poems for enjoyment, or we have these poems for our syllabus prescribed by universities or institutions. Now, the second poet here we have Dom Morias, 1938 to 2004. This is the first Indian English poet of international recognition. Means his poetry not only became famous in India but abroad too. He got recognition in England too. And here we have some of his collections: A Beginning, Poems, John Nobody. Then we have a very important figure called Purushottam Lal, 1929 to 2010. He is the founder of Writers Workshop. Now, Writers Workshop is a publication, but it is a movement we can call in the history of Indian writing in English, because Writers Workshop has published so many poems or so many books in Indian writing in English, and his place is very important in Indian writing in English, and he is the founder. Here is the picture of Purushottam Lal, and he also a very good poet and composed the Parrot's Death and other poems, Change, They Said, Draupadi and Jayadratha and other poems, Calcutta, a long poem. So these are some of the collections published by P. Lal, and he is the founder of Writers Workshop, whose contribution is very important in Indian writing in English. And he was not only a poet but translator too. He translated the Bhagavad Gita, the Dhammapada, Ghalib's Law poems, etc. So this is the Purushottam Lal, the founder of Writers Workshop. Next we have number 4, Adil Jusawala, 1940, born, Land Sea End 1962, and Missing Person 1976 are the two famous collections of poems. Then we have A.K. Ramanujan, 1929 to 1993, and he is a very popular Indian English poet. His poems have memory as a central part, or memory plays a creative role in his poetry. If you read his poetry, you will understand. The Striders, Relations, The Interior Landscape, Speaking of Shiva, etc. are his collections of poetry. So memory or recalling has given more importance in his poems, or we can say that it is a central part of his poems. Then we have Parthasarthi, 1934, Rough Passage, and this Rough Passage is a very long poem, and we have three parts of it. Very first, Exile, then we have Trial, and then we have Homecoming. So our Parthasarthi is also important in the post-independence Indian English poetry. And here we have A.K. Ramanujan. This is the A.K. Ramanujan. Next we have number 7, Jiv Patel. He is a very important Parsi poet in post-independence, and he composed poems How Do You Withstand Body. This type of collections we have on the name of Jiv Patel. This is the portrait of Jiv Patel. Then we have A.K. Mehrotra, 1947, and here we have his remarks on his own. Here I will read: not an Indian poet but a poet writing in a universal language of poetry, a feeling of love and hate and sex. And we have some of his collections called Bharat Mata, a prayer, Woodcuts on Paper. Then we have Poems, Poems and Poemas, 9 Enclosures. These are some of the famous collections of poetry by A.K. Mehrotra. Then we have Pritish Nandi, also a very important poet in post-independence, 1951. More than a dozen collections are on his name. He is a vast writer of poetry, or he composed so many poems and collections of poems, but some of the famous are Of Gods and Olives. Then we have the poetry of Pritish Nandi, Tonight, The Savage Right, etc. These are some famous collections of poetry by Pritish Nandi. Next we have number 10, K.K.N. Daruwala, 1937, and we have his collections Under Orion, Apparition in April, and Crossing of Rivers. Then we have Shukri Kumar. Now this is the portrait of Shukri Kumar. He is an academician or professor of English language and literature. 1921 to 2017 is his lifespan. An academician and poet. Irony, a feature of his poetry. Now if you read his, actually he's not only a poet but prose writer too. He composed some famous short stories too. So in his short stories and poems we find irony, or contrasted things are combined together, and this is the basic feature of his writing. So here we have some of his poetry collections, Articulate Silences. Look at this title silences, but it's articulate. So articulate silences again states the irony. Then we have cobwebs in the sun. Cobwebs in the sun. Here too you can find subterfuges and woodpecker. So these are some of his famous collections of poems which are important in post-independence development of Indian writing in English. You can more explore about these poets or their works. You can just Google each work and you find some of the information regarding this. You can say collections of poetry or poems, more information. Then we have famous poet called Jayanta Mahapatra, 1928. Close Sky, 10 by 10, Swayamvara and other poems, A Rain of Rights, Waiting Relationship, The False Start. These are some of the collections by Jayant Mahapatra. Next we have number 13, Arun Kolatkar. Now Arun Kolatkar is a bilingual poet who composed in Marathi and English too. So here we have some of his poetry collections, and in which we find that Jejuri is very important. There are 31 short sections in the Jejuri, which is published in 1976, and he also received the Commonwealth Poetry Prize for his poetry as a poet. Now Jejuri is very important, and still we read Jejuri. Jejuri is nothing but there is a place called Jejuri near Pune, and when he goes to Jejuri, he observes there the Jejuri and he composes poems right from his going to Jejuri and coming back. So there are 31 sections, short sections on the Jejuri, and you will get the ethos there of the Jejuri and Indian culture in Jejuri. Now we have women writers, because women writers also have played, or women poets also have played a great role in the development of Indian writing in English and especially poetry. There are so many women writers, but we have picked a few only here. And very first in women writers we have Kamla Das or Kamla Suraiya Das, 1934 to 2009 lifespan. She is the most acclaimed Indian women poets. Kamla Das, you find when you search on internet or you just Google, you will get all the information about Kamla Das, and she is the most acclaimed Indian women poets. Now we have some of collections of poetry. Summer in Calcutta, 1965, The Descendants, 1967, The Old Playhouse and Other Poems, 1973, My Story. Now this is My Story is not a collection of poetry, but it is biography, which is very famous, and she is very free in telling the things to the world, her experiences, and she included almost all experiences of her life in My Story, or these are the real story of Kamla Das if you read My Story. So this is the story of Kamla Das, and here is the picture of Kamla Das. She composed so many poems if you read, and she also composed some prose pieces, very fine. And here you have My Story, her autobiography. Other women poets we have here Monika Verma, Gauri Deshpande, then we have Mamta Kalia, then we have Suniti Namjoshi, Meena Alexander, we have Roshan Alkazi, then we have Margaret Chatterjee, we have Mary Ann Das Gupta, then we have Leela Dharmaraj, Khushari Dyson, etc. So these are some of the women poets who have contributed in the development of poetry, and each one's poetry is distinct and they have different kinds of elements added in their poetry. We are briefly talking about all these poets in the video. If you want more information, just you can read the book of M.K. Naik's on history of history of Indian literature in English, or you can just Google each poet or the collections of poetry here we discussed, so that you will get more information if you want. So I hope this is enough to understand how Indian writing in English or especially post-independence poetry has developed, or who are the contributors to the post-independence development of poetry. So I hope this is helpful. Let's meet in the next video. Thank you very much for watching the complete video.